First of all, thank you for inviting me here and hosting us for the last couple of days. It's been a very good and interesting discussion. And of course, I was given a title for my talk, which was about the collective domain. Over the last couple of days, that's kind of evolved also in the context of a book that me and my practice. 00 in London have been working on over the last couple of months. And effectively I came to the conclusion that we talk a lot about the collective domain, we talk a lot about our ambitions for public spaces in the cities of today. We've been doing that, for example, in Britain over the last 20 years. But I would argue that we've spent enormous amounts of money on public spaces and on the public realm, but we have not always created a civic landscape. Far from it, in fact. We've created spaces that citizens don't feel they are connected to, and now, of course, the money is gone. Over the last couple of years, we've come from a period of public wealth into a period of relative public poverty, and we've failed so far. So what is it to guarantee that we can do any better over the next couple of years? Well, first of all, I think it's the realization that we will not have a civic domain, a collective domain, a functioning public realm, unless we have a civic economy. And that's why our practice has been focusing on the conditions for creating that more civic economy. And when I talk about a civic economy, I talk about fundamentally an economy that is democratic in terms of its ownership, in terms of its sense of belonging, in terms of its in terms of the way in which it unleashes the creativity and energy and drive and resources of citizens to be brought to bear on collective issues. So, hence, making space, remaking place, and this emerging civic economy. Partially, this is, as I said, a book that we've been making, aimed at a primarily in English audience and context, but which I feel is relevant wider. Now, this is the cover of the book, and what you see is almost a modeling of a very everyday urban fabric. It's not one of futuristic visions of a 21st or whatever 22nd century city. It's not a futuristic vision, because it's actually a little bit more humble. It actually asks the question, if we have the cityscape that we have today, and we are in a resource-constrained future where there may be population growth or there may not be such massive population growth. There may be economic growth, there may not be such massive economic growth. How can we take the resources that we have, perhaps reconfigure them, perhaps add a few more pieces, but how can we essentially work with what we have and give it different meaning, make it more democratic, make it more collaborative? And so we collected a series of examples that are already going on, that already in Britain and abroad are already starting to work with the resources that we have and building a different kind of urban landscape. And how we define this civic economy? It's effectively where civil society meets entrepreneurship for the 21st century. And of course, many of these elements of entrepreneurship for the 21st century, entrepreneurship 2.0, are already with us, and we know them. Some of the best companies are already working in this open, collaborative way. Take Lego, for example, the manufacturer of stuff to play with for kids. They've changed their way. And I don't know if you know the story of Lego, but 5 years ago they were in deep crisis because, of course, computer games and all sorts of other stuff was taking over the attention of kids. And Lego was kind of something of the 20th century, wasn't it? What the stuff that I played with, but certainly not that kids of today played with. 5 years later, Lego is booming. They've never done better than now. What have they done? They've changed something in the way that they interface with their core audience. Kids nowadays can upload their own designs onto the Lego website, and Lego builds it for them. So they say what they want to make, and Lego gives them the pieces so they can make it. And even better still, the designs that kids have made are on the website of Lego, and other kids can look at those and transform them, can improve on them, add on them. So all of a sudden, a product that's been pushed down from a manufacturer to kids, the 20th century model, has now become a very 21st century idea where actually it's the customers who are in the driving seat. And it's not just a relationship between the customer and the company, but it's also a peer-to-peer relation where kids can learn from each other directly. There's examples like this all over. This is how companies like Nike are changing, how there's new t-shirt manufacturers which let you upload your own design for t-shirts, and then depending on what gets voted for most, they decide what actually makes them to the production line, thereby knowing much, much faster than traditional clothing manufacturers what will be a hit with customers. So, entrepreneurship 2.0. It's collaborative, it's open, it's aware of resources and how they're best corralled. It's using crowd creativity as opposed to expert creativity. And it's based on values. It's based on values that are not just about short-term gain, but they're also about sustainability, about social connectivity, and about broader public value. And if you connect that to the civil society of our cities, of our places, something very powerful happens. All of a sudden, decision-making in cities and the production of the everyday urban environment isn't an expert arena only, it becomes a democratic arena. And therefore, in changing how we build cities, it's not just what we build anymore. This is very much about how we build it. So it's not just about what the building is that we envisage for our city hall. It's also how we go about the process of building it, of designing it, of having the discussion around it, of bringing it to life. In that sense, the old saying, the medium is the message, because it's the medium, the process through which we achieve things that actually contains so much of the story that later on we'll tell. There's so many objects in the world, and architecture over the last 20 years has dumbed down. We've become so obsessed with objects that we've forgotten that the real stories that we tell each other and that make life worth living are actually not in the objects, they're in the ways in which we build them. They're in the narrative. And so fundamentally, this is about a different type of economy. No mistake about it. This is realizing that over the 20th century, we had different models, whether it was sort of a communist state-led social state or the welfare state that we had in the West. Then we've swung all the way to the private-led economy, where agency had the ability to do was no longer in the hand of state officials, but it was in the hands of executives. Resources are effectively corralled by corporates. The markets are effectively the markets of capital. Property is owned privately, etc., etc. Information is owned privately. Thank you. My voice is indeed a little bit hoarse. It'll get worse. And we need to shift that model. We need to shift that model, and moreover, it's already happening. We are building this civic economy. It's not us. I mean, this is what's going on in the world today, where agency, the capacity to act, resources, entrepreneurship is becoming more and more civic, more and more distributed. Property, or at least access to property, is becoming more distributed, and information is becoming shared in different ways. And yesterday, I heard a lot about how the city of Tallinn is already sharing its information digitally in very different ways with citizens. So this is not just some sort of pipe dream. This is real. And the book that we wrote is about showing a series of examples of this economy that is indeed real. This is a project that we've been involved with ourselves. It's called The Hub. It started 6 years ago. It's now gone global. There's 30 spaces in the world, give or take. which are shared workspaces for social entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs who are configuring different for-profit, not-for-profit ventures, focused on ethical supply chains for fashion, focused on energy savings devices, focused on all these kind of things. And it's an economy of spaces that's being built, but it's not just about space, it's also about the way in which people can connect with each other in those spaces, because young starting entrepreneurs have similar needs to learn a lot from each other, to think about their business models, to find new legal forms to suit their purposes. And of course they need access to cheap space, but they most of all need access to a network of like-minded peers. And this is being built. It's also being built in a different way. This space in central London, it was a very expensive location. Part of the way in which we built it was actually not by going to a bank to ask for a loan, because there's no money to be had for an experimental venture like this. Not to just ask for subsidy, because then from the state, because then we would be dependent on policy objectives that may not have been our own. But we actually went out to a network of around 200 people, entrepreneurs, people who shared our sense of mission, and asked them for relatively small sums of money. But 200 times something between 500 and 2,000 pounds, all of a sudden gave us a capital of 160,000 pounds that we could work with to deliver this building. And of course, these people are making a return on their money, 6 or 7% a year, better than you get in the savings account. So it's a win-win, and it allows us to develop a new type of environment in a way that is 21st century, working with peers and like-minded individuals. And so on, there's so many of these examples, and I won't go into detail now. I think later on I will give a few more. But this is how our shopping streets may be changing. This is an example from New York, where in a Brooklyn shopping street, there is a bizarre superhero supply store, which sells robots and capes for superheroes. Behind that shop is a tutoring center for kids who have difficulty learning to read and have difficulty concentrating because their situation at home is difficult, or they're not being supported. But these kids don't like to go to school either, or they don't like to go to after-school classes either, because you're made to feel as if you're a loser. You need extra help, and you're poor kid. It's not easy, is it, for you? Whereas here, they enter this magic shop where everything is possible, and behind there's all these writers who give them one-on-one attention, not because they're sad kids who need help, but because they're creative kids that have all sorts of dreams and ideas, and they just need a little bit of help to put them down on paper. And then the stories that they write are sold in the shop. And guess what? The shop makes money for that writing initiative. So it costs the public sector absolutely no money, but it creates all these outcomes that schools really struggle to achieve. And this is now growing. It started in San Francisco, there's one in New York, there's one in London, and there's one in Dublin. And these are magic places in which you realize that design is unbelievably important. You need to create these environments, but it's not the kind of architectural top-down design that we used to think of in the past. And so on and so forth. There's a town in which, this is in northern England, where citizens have grown fruit and vegetables and fruit trees all over the public realm. And not only that, they convinced the railway station, the police station, the local health center, and even the fire service to also do that. So there's fruit and vegetables being grown all over the place. And all of a sudden a different conversation emerges about sustainability, about the ways in which we want to live, not because it's some sort of preachy people who tell other people how they should live, but just because together people are building a different kind of way of relating to the public realm. And this, I would say, are all elements of a civic city. It's the ideas of the many. It's the ideas that come from unlikely sources. There's a town also in England that decided that its internet was so bad and that big corporates were not serving them with faster broadband speed that they decided to do it themselves. So they had a meeting, they raised the cash, and after a few battles with the regulatory authorities, they got to something really humble, you know, some sort of little electricity box. But that is their own internet. Yeah? And it makes money for the village, as well as giving them better connections. So these are the problems that we used to think of as massive problems. Energy, telecommunications, education. They're now being resolved and worked on through much more unpredictable means, which makes city governance, of course, also much more unpredictable. You have to do it together with citizens, because otherwise you'll never know about their ideas, and you'll never know about how they can actually happen much faster. Much faster, more creatively, more effectively. And there's a few things, there's a set of key behaviors that I think we need to talk about, and that we need, in thinking about our cities, we need to sort of recognize. Because this is not about telling you that you need to have a pirate supply store that teaches kids. Your issues in the city may well be different. I'm sure they are. But it's about these shared characteristics. One, from massive capital and massive resource projects, we need to go to distributed resource projects, where the reality in England, and I don't exactly know, but I imagine the reality here is similar, that there used to be massive scale capital, private or state capital, available to do massive projects. Increasingly that won't be the case anymore. So you need to think about unlocking the resources and the drive and the energy and the creativity, and indeed the finances of many more people. That means that you need to work in networks that are most of all collaborative and non-hierarchical, and that find the intelligence in the crowd, as opposed to depend on the intelligence of experts alone. And it's about ways in which we can use scarce resources much more effectively, so that, less important than the ownership of resources, it's about access to resources. So in London we see car clubs and we see bicycle sharing systems, which allow many people to share that same resource and make it therefore work much harder. And that workspace example that I showed is exactly of the same nature. Why have spaces that are empty, desks that are empty 40% of the time, if you can concentrate it and share them much more flexibly? And those are city organizing principles. So, in short, a civic economy, as we call it, and as I'm convinced that it's relevant for thinking about how we go about exploring and building these new city areas. It's not a sector. This is not about saying that the private sector is bad and the public sector or the citizen sector is good. Not at all. It's a kind of behavior that creative people and civic-minded entrepreneurs from across the public, the private, and the third sector are increasingly deploying. It's a shared way of working. What it has at its heart, it's about creating deep value, real value, whether it's in education, whether it's in energy. It's the value that users can genuinely appreciate, as opposed to creating the sort of the very thin value that speculative development has often created. So this is about creating a real estate in our cities, as opposed to just creating more real estate. It's deeply collaborative, and it's also something that is driven by entrepreneurs. It cannot be planned for by rigid strategies and plans, but that doesn't mean that planners have no role, because it's often planners, smart planners, and I can tell a few more examples later on in the discussion. It's smart architects, smart planners who recognize this and who therefore start providing the link roles and start brokering these relationships and see it as their role, not to just create those 2D plans, but to actually pick out the projects that actually can make this happen. It's about the interface and interaction between massive issues and small ideas, and between large-scale spaces and how they're being animated by small-scale processes, and about new institutions in the wider sense. I need to move on, so this is the moment to say thank you.
This is the last one.
I think so.
Yes.
Well, there you go. But just a few more points. What does this concretely mean, I think, for Tallinn? I think you're on the right track. I mean, with that culture mile, you've created something that already uses micro initiatives, relatively cheap starting points that can unlock a lot of energy, a lot of ideas and drive. So I think you're absolutely on the right track. And I think it's now taking that active role in what, as John said, you want to have a big vision, but you also want to create starting points that are light touch and that can be achieved through small pilot projects. Very much in the case of the context of the City Hall, I think it's about curating that change process. A concrete idea. Imagine that not just for the building of the project, which you already start to have, but for the animation of that civic square, you also hold a competition. You hold a competition among civic society in the city, asking for ideas from all social and civic entrepreneurs to start hosting that space and to curate different events. And all of a sudden that becomes part of the conversation. You find unlikely allies, and you may even give them small budgets, micro budgets, to work with. And I think if you do that, if you start to create that hosting role, that curating role for the spaces, instead of purely about physicality, then you start to create the social contact and the democracy that you really want. So the building is a perfect starting point. And there's the few extra things that you can do that you've partially already started doing that will make this a true civic economy. And I'll leave it at that because I think we're running way over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.